All right, welcome everybody. We're recording now. We are welcome to our Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines virtual field trip. My name is Rob Diaz de Villegas. I'm a producer of WFSU TV. I produce ecology segments for the WFSU Ecology blog and for Local Roots. With me is Brian Pelc with the Nature Conservancy in Florida. Hi, Brian.
Hey, how are you? What a beautiful morning to be together.
Yes. Look at. This is part of. This is funded by a grant from PBS for our show Age of Nature. Age of Nature is a national program that will air on WFSU on October 14th at 10 p.m. And they were giving out grants to local stations. The show explores the human relationship with nature, and it does it with these beautiful stories from all across the world and how different watersheds are connected and all of that. And they gave out grants to stations to explore that locally. So there are three questions that we'll be exploring. The three questions are, here they are. What have our past mistakes taught us about nature? How is our understanding of nature changing the way we live? And as the challenges we face mount, where are we heading next? And so we decided to explore that on the Apalachicola River, and more specifically the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines region. And so we talk a lot about mistakes on the Apalachicola River. We talk a lot about oysters and droughts and all of that, and that's part of it. But we're also addressing here in the Bluffs and Ravines this sort of bigger habitat loss that's occurred throughout the Southeast that the Nature Conservancy has been working to restore, which is a native longleaf pine. And so, thank you, Trish. And, we'll be talking more about that later, but for right now, I want to thank our partners, the Nature Conservancy in Florida, Apalachicola Riverkeeper, Florida Native Plant Society, and the UF Thompson Earth Systems Institute. See, we have a fair amount of participants. We definitely want to encourage everybody to use the chat to ask all the questions they think of as we watch videos and as we talk about all these different dynamics in the uplands and the ravines and the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines and throughout the whole Apalachicola River system. So we're going to get started now with our first video. We're going to look at an animal that has become really rare in the Florida Panhandle that's kind of making a comeback here in the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines.
Today we're out searching for eastern indigo snakes that have been reintroduced to the preserve.
North America's largest native snake has all but disappeared from our area. Here at the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines Preserve, the Nature Conservancy and its partners are looking to bring it back.
We're right here, and we're going to walk to the south and check this area here, and then we'll walk back up to the north and check that area. And then Jen will stay in the middle, and then I'll go to the right, and we'll just kind of head to the end.
All right.
And if you get one, holler out. But the indigos once were common all across southern Alabama, southern Georgia, and the entire state of Florida, even down into the Keys.
The eastern indigo snake is now mostly gone from the northern part of its range.
And the theory is it's because the gopher tortoises, which the indigos rely upon to escape the cold, to get into the burrows, the gopher tortoises have been eliminated from many of the conservation areas, or the populations are very depressed all across northern Florida. And now there is a quite robust population of gopher tortoises here at the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines Preserve. And for that very reason, the Eastern Indigo Snake Reintroduction Committee selected ABRP as the first reintroduction site in Florida.
All right, so Brian, let's talk about gopher tortoises. This is such an important animal and it serves so many other animals in the longleaf ecosystem. So let's talk about the importance of gopher tortoises and why they have become so rare in North Florida.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great piece. And I was about to write in the chat, aren't gopher tortoises just the cutest critters in the world? And then I got cut off because now we're live again. So besides being the cutest critters in the world, they are super important as what we call ecosystem engineers. And what that means is every organism makes an impact on their ecosystem, but some of them have an impact that ripples out to many, many other species. And gopher tortoises are a great example of that. They are evolved to dig these phenomenal burrows And for a variety of reasons, lots of other animals use those burrows either along with the gopher tortoise or after the gopher tortoise has decided to move on to other places. And there's over 300 species, many, many insects, many reptiles, birds, small mammals, burrowing owls can even use gopher tortoise burrows. So a lot of these animals don't make burrows of their own, but because of, in the case of eastern indigo snakes, it has to do with regulating their temperature. With many of these animals, it has to do with having places to escape from predators or even escape from fire. So, this is a safe zone in these burning ecosystems where, if you're a pretty slow moving critter and you don't have, let's say, wings to get out of the way, going underground is a safe option so that as that fire passes through, for that 10, maybe 15 minutes when it's a little bit too spicy to be up above ground, they can go below ground and hang out and then head back up to continue their workabouts. So these ecosystem engineers are super important for all of these other creatures. And as we started to see gopher tortoises decline, which happened over the course of the last century, many of those other species that rely on those tortoises holes, they started to decline too. So that ripple effect, not only is it, it's on the plus side, all these creatures can take advantage of it, but on the bottom side, on the negative side, when those gopher tortoise burrows go away, all these other creatures, they can't just, whip out their toolbox and start making their own burrows. They are obligated and reliant on these engineered spaces for them to go into. And one of the reasons that we have lost so many gopher tortoises in the Panhandle is that for a long time, they were a scrumptious option for human beings. We are a predator and we are part of our ecology here, but we don't always know where to draw the line. And sometimes we have tools at our fingertips that make it, more difficult for the wildlife around us to be able to maintain decent population sizes. So, and what I mean is that when we go hunting, sometimes we don't know where to stop. And I think gopher tortoise is a good example of that, where, they're pretty easy to catch. There was many, many decades where they were a convenient food source for people, settlers, farmers. And we frankly ate the heck out of our gopher tortoise populations, to the point where if we go to other parts of the region, further north, further south, where they just weren't quite so popular of a food item, their populations didn't decline nearly as much. So there's a little bit of a science experiment there where, we have a treatment, if you will, we have an effect here in the Panhandle. And if we go to other places where that treatment's a little bit different, we can see a population change, and we can compare those two. And what we've seen here in the Panhandle is that we just ate too many of them. And so there went the burrows, and there went many other obligate species like eastern indigo snakes.
Right. And so in the Panhandle, so that became rare in the Panhandle. So on the Bluffs and Ravines, we see that they're doing all right. And then, so that's an important ecosystem service that provides for a lot of animals there up in the uplands. Now, in our next video, we're going to take a look now how the uplands are connected to this other really unique feature of the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines, which are steephead ravines.
We're here in Liberty County in the sort of central eastern portion of the Florida Panhandle. Geographically, we're in an interesting spot. A large geological formation called the Cody Escarpment is just north of where we are right now.
The Cody Escarpment is an ancient shoreline from when sea level was higher, and the high sandhills along this rise were once beach dunes. Carved into these bluffs are geologically rare steephead ravines. The Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines region is one of 5 biodiversity hotspots in North America. There are plants and animals here that are found nowhere else on Earth. And it all starts with sand that is up to 150 feet deep.
We are here actually at an ecotone. An ecotone is the term that we use to explain where 2 different ecosystems come together. And this is the ecotone between the uplands and our steephead ravines or slope forests. The Nature Conservancy bought this piece of property in the early 80s because of this sort of strange formation. And these don't occur in many places, even in many places on the entire planet. There are only a handful. And the reason it's so unique and rare is because of the kind of erosion that results in this kind of formation. And that erosion has almost everything to do with that same 150 foot of sand that we're standing on right now. Even though we bought this property for this unique geological formation, the whole area around it, all these uplands, they needed management as well. They're connected, right?
The uplands here are an ecosystem shaped by fire.
Hey, this is longleaf pine, Pinus palustris. It's a very fire-adapted pine species. It's not the only fire-adapted pine we have in Florida, but it would have existed in places away from the coast where fire was a regular 2 to 3 year occurrence. And because of that, its whole lifestyle and evolution is somewhat tied into fire. And a huge part of the fire dynamic, I mean, longleaf has evolved with the pressures of fire, but it's also a contributor to fire. Longleaf needles sometimes are the best and only fuel that are available to do this good work that we need to do.
The other important fuel in this ecosystem is fire-adapted grasses, most importantly wiregrass. The Nature Conservancy burned this area in May. Just 3 days later, wiregrass was already growing back.
These grasses have adapted to come back, to respond pretty quickly from fire. Like you can see, we burned this in May and these grasses are ready to produce fruit. So we focus on these plants because they're like the magic ingredient that all the other stuff kind of, orbits around. If we can bring those back, then we get the fire back. And when we get the fire back, we create the conditions for all of these other species to come back too, that aren't necessarily what we're aiming for when we're out there doing the seed collection. But it's like step one in the recipe is, bring back those workhorse species so that we can start burning it. And then over time, Mother Nature does the rest of the restoration by bringing things in like Mother Nature does on the air, on wild animals. We also carry stuff around.
You get a sense there of sort of the diversity of the ecosystem in the uplands, but also you have this other feature, the ravines down in there and the slopes, and then the ravine bottom. Let's talk about that, Brian, sort of how those combine to make this area a kind of a biodiversity hotspot.
Yeah, so the ravines serve a very interesting function from a plant perspective, and that is 30,000 years ago and multiple times before that, we've gone through ice ages where plants very, very slowly migrate to places that are more comfortable for them. And as the climate changes, in these cases, as it got very, very cold, species from up north, from the Appalachian Mountains up into the Carolinas and Virginia, slowly migrated down, trying to stay in front of that cold that was moving down from the Arctic. And as those species moved down, they occupied space all over Florida. And then when the climate warmed up again, a lot of Florida became too warm for them, right? I mean, as the temperature goes up, they start moving back north again to seek a climate that is more to their evolution. However, in those ravines, it stays cool. It's almost like a little refrigerated museum of species that moved into Florida tens of thousands of years ago. And because it was cozy enough in those ravines, they never had to leave. Meanwhile, all the other species, the ecosystems, the communities turned into more of what we see now, these dry, warm climate kind of environments. So when we put them together in one property where we've got the high and dry, warm, deserty plants, cactuses, wiregrass, lots of sand, right next to a place that's cool and shady and wet, we can have all of these organisms living right in close proximity to each other. So from a conservation standpoint, it's like high five, huge bang for the buck, because in that 5,000 acres, we have the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of acres of different ecosystems that wouldn't under any other circumstances be so close together, but they're jammed right up against each other because of those ravines. They give us this sort of unique and somewhat weird view into what's going on 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 miles away from here, where it's much cooler and wetter and in some cases shadier. So
Right.
it's a really unique place to have them all together.
Yeah, and they're tied together, we see by the fire. And let's take a look, Trish, at that slide of the Longleaf Habitat. So we have, this is a habitat that has lost 95% of its coverage of what used to cover the entire Southeast. And then that also means the loss of fire and all the benefits it had to bring those plants out. And I guess what we're going to see in the next video is sort of what happens when that fire goes away. What could happen when the fire goes away? What would it affect? And it's not just plants and animals, as we see.
If we can imagine this is a forest, and it has a certain amount of water. Let's say this is the amount of water over a year. And in it right now, I've got some silver or some aluminum straws. We'll pretend that those are pine trees. And these pine trees are sippers. They're not chuggers, so, you know, a little bit. Doesn't take a whole lot. They're able to grow, they're able to photosynthesize, cast needles, the fire cycle continues, and all the while, they're just sort of sipping. But here in the understory, we have a variety of native hardwood trees, oaks, other species, that when they're burned every 2 to 3 years, they stay relatively small and they have relatively small sized stems. But would fire be taken away in maybe only 10, 15 years, these trees would grow up and start really chugging the water. And of course, the more straws in the water, the more water is going to go away. So not only are we adding species that use more water, but we're adding more of them. And so our water level becomes less and less. And where does this water go? This water goes up into the atmosphere, which is part of the water cycle, right? Where that water isn't going to go is into the Apalachicola River to feed oysters.
By suppressing the growth of woody trees, fire opens up the landscape for grasses and herbaceous plants, and also for water to pass down. In other parts of Florida, sandhills feed water into the Floridan aquifer, which is the source of our drinking water in springs. But here in the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines region, water starts a lot higher above the water table, and when it moves, it carves into the land.
Here in the sandhill, we have this dynamic of water that hits the ground, almost immediately percolating down through the sand and hitting the water table. And water always tries to move itself along the gradient of gravity, along the path of least resistance. So what happens is all of that focus, all of that energy that moving water underneath us finds that spot and all carries along that same path. It starts to erode and carry the soil away just along that one path.
Over geologic time, that small path carves narrow ravines in the sandhill. As water continues to flow in the steephead stream, the ravine continues to grow further and further away from the river.
We just walked down that 150 feet, and coming out of the head of the steephead as a slurry lake of soil and water mixed, finding the path of least resistance and all funneling out and creating this stream. Stream dumps into the Apalachicola River, carrying sand and nutrients and things from the upland. And then carrying it down into the Gulf of Mexico, creating islands, and they are islands of deposits. And all the way from Georgia and all along the Apalachicola River, the Chattahoochee, the Flint, all of that sediment gets carried downriver and deposited. The interconnectedness of these different ecosystems is both astounding, but also super important because we need to realize that our actions up here affect what's going on down there. The water quality, the use, all of those are directly related to what's going on 50 miles south of here and in the Gulf of Mexico.
Right. So these are, as we see, interconnected systems, and they're interconnected over quite a large area. If we can get that slide of the ACF basin map up, you see that the system really starts in the same, the foothills of the same Appalachian Mountains up in Georgia. The next slide. And that water flows down from along the Chattahoochee River, where it meets with the Flint River, and you see that it's almost the entire, it drains almost the entire western side of Georgia and all those ecosystems there. And they meet at the Florida border where they form the Apalachicola River. And there's water and also sand. Sand that those islands are made of comes from as far away as they're bits and pieces of the mountains crunched up into little bits of rock that form sand particles on St. Vincent and St. George Island. And that's also the water that feeds the estuary. Now you see along the corridor, you see several little lakes along the river, and those are all behind dams, including Lake Seminole there. And so that water is also restricted. And so that's when we think about mistakes being made and thinking back to the three questions. One of the things that ecologically we're still figuring out is sort of how best to manage the water so Georgia gets what it needs, and also Apalachicola Bay gets what it needs. Right now, Apalachicola oyster fisheries closed for 5 years. There was a fishery crash 8 years ago during a harsh drought. When there's a harsh drought, water is kept in Georgia behind the dams to feed a number of different, everything from agricultural to the city of Atlanta. So there are lawsuits now. This is something that's still being figured out in the ACF system. Now, back to the bluffs and ravines. The part of it that's important to us here is that the water that gets down into the river is clean, that the fresh water is transmitting the way it would naturally, and that's sort of what fire, as we see, helps us do. Now, I think we're gonna go ahead and skip to the fourth video. So we've seen sort of how this habitat, sustains plant life. It sustains the movement of water, sustains itself in the uplands. Fire in the uplands sustains life up there, but also helps out down in the ravines. And now we're going to see how all of that sort of comes together to help out the animals that live in this area.
Plants, they are a fascinating organism in the way that they organize themselves. And when there are limits to the water or to the nutrients in the soil, you start to see sort of a fingerprint of like what sandhill looks like. And because there isn't just an endless amount of water or an endless amount of, let's say, nitrogen or whatever in the soil, there's sort of an even rationing that happens. And what you end up with is all this space. But you can imagine if you're a critter, like let's say you're a fox squirrel or an indigo snake or a gopher tortoise, these are amazing little networks of space to move around and create a life, right? You've got food, you've got cover, because if you kind of scan across the landscape, it's not bare by any stretch, but when you look straight down, I'm seeing 80% sand in front of me.
Without that openness, a gopher tortoise would have no space to dig a burrow. Gopher tortoise burrows are where indigo snakes seek warmth in the colder months, and where they make their nests. But they need the ravines too.
We're here at the bottom of a ravine, and not unlikely to encounter an eastern indigo that may be down here looking for copperheads to eat. This isn't, of course, gopher tortoise habitat, and we know that indigo snakes use the burrows of the gopher tortoise. So it goes to speak to the varied existence that a lot of organisms have. So even though indigo snakes are released in the upland and they live in the gopher tortoise, this is where they come to grocery shop and make their life healthy and full of nutrients. They come down here to get food and maybe escape the heat a little bit. Just like the theme of this whole day, I think, is that these are complicated and interactive dynamics that are going around us, and this indigo snake is just one good example of that.
Indigo snakes are apex predators. That means they need a healthy food web to thrive, and that starts at the bottom, with plants and the animals that eat them.
Insects are the most critical part of the food chain. They are what turn green things, like leaves, into protein in the form of themselves to move up the food chain. 96% of all of our terrestrial bird species, all of our songbirds, they feed their young, their babies, exclusively insects. Their babies don't eat seeds or berries. Without lots of caterpillars, you don't have baby birds. You don't have regeneration of bird species on land.
Birds and amphibians eat insects. Other snake species eat birds, amphibians, and small plant-eating mammals. Indigo snakes eat all those other snakes. They may not eat plants and insects directly, but indigo snakes need them. They need open uplands as well as moist, crowded ravines. They are just one of the many connections between ecosystems in the Apalachicola watershed.
It was in discovering that to manage and protect the rare species in the ravines, we also had to manage what was going on upland from it. And so it's not unlike the same story with the Apalachicola River, where what we do up in the uplands directly runs downhill into the rivers, and then that runs down into the Gulf of Mexico. So on every scale, that same kind of idea is happening.
All right, so going back to those three questions, the first ones, what have we learned from past mistakes? And then, there's, well, where do we go from here? So I want to talk about, Brian, sort of how, the habitat has been, largely disappeared, but we're bringing it back, and you guys are bringing it back. And I want to talk about this amazing restoration work being done on the upland surrounding steephead ravines in Soraya State Park that the Nature Conservancy is a part of.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I appreciate that. We've been working for over a decade now to try and turn some of these lands, and some of these are pretty rare, rare dynamics that are happening in Sandhill, where, we've got lots and lots of oaky forests around Florida, and we've got lots and lots of pine plantations, and those are important. Those are important to our culture. They're important to the economy, but we don't necessarily have a lot of functioning sandhill ecosystem that is somewhat representative of what would have been here, 150 or 200 years ago. And that's kind of our target out at ABRP, is to try and, recreate or at least, bring back some of that functionality. And it is hard work. We have to start with the mistakes of the past. And there's a couple of good examples of that. When we bought the property that's now ABRP, it was a pine plantation that was managed by a timber company. And back in the 40s and 50s, there was a really common strategy to try and make their pines grow faster and better, where they would scrape all of the topsoil and all of the seed bank into these long, what they call windrows, which is like a big sort of composting pile, if you will. And so when we came to do the restoration there, we had to try and undo that mess. I mean, we basically had to flatten out those big mounds. We had to try and figure out whether there was enough native seeds still in the soil for it to recover on its own. And when we determined that there wasn't, we had to figure out how to bring in seed from parts of the preserve that weren't quite so messed up to the parts of the preserve that really needed it most. So we basically created this whole sort of donor and recipient system. And where our Garden of Eden hiking trail is, that's open to the public, if anyone wants to go check that out, it's a great trail, goes up and down 2 different steephead ravines. But where it travels through that upland was one of the best parts of the preserve. And so that became our donor site that we used. We figured out how to do seed collection. We figured out how to grow wiregrass through a lot of science. We had funding at the time from the Department of Transportation. We have since gotten funding from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and others, the Environmental Protection Agency. So lots of folks have been helping us to do this work and create these thousands of acres of returned sandhill. Now, it's important for us to remember that it took literally millions of years for these communities, these plant communities, to come together in the way that they were 200 years ago. And we're not going to get that back in 10 or 20 years. But like I mentioned in the piece, if we can just try and build the fire system back. So if we aim for those great fuels and put those fuels out, and then we can start burning those systems as frequently as we know historically happened, which was about every 2 to 3 years. And it almost always happened in what we call the growing season, which was May, June, a little bit into July. Then we're basically building the skeleton that Mother Nature can then add all the muscle in the skin, if I can use a metaphor of a person. So lots of species are going to move in on their own through their normal sort of evolutionary routes. If they've got seed that fly on the wind, then they'll come in on the wind. If they've got seed that stick to animals or whatever, then slowly but surely we're going to see our communities becoming more and more diverse. So we sometimes get questions about, well, how do we know what it looked like when we got started? We don't know to the detail that we're able to study ecosystems nowadays what it looked like, but we have some pretty good ideas. There were lots of botanists and early explorers that described these areas pretty well. We certainly know what's in the pollen record and things like that. So we have some tools in the toolbox to try and kind of recreate what we think it looked like. But more importantly, we really want to recreate that functionality. And the way that we know it's working is our gopher tortoise populations started to get better, bigger, more diversity of ages, meaning that we had mama gopher tortoises that were making baby gopher tortoises, and those baby gopher tortoises were making tiny little holes and burrows, and we were able to go across the landscape and see all these different size burrows as an indication of the diversity of different ages of gopher tortoises. And so we use these clues to help guide us towards at least what's working. It's not necessarily perfect, but it's what's working.
Gotcha. Well, that's a great note to end on. Our half hour just flew by. So just to wrap up, I see someone asking, when is this airing on WFSU? This specifically won't, but a similar video will air this Thursday on Local Roots at 8 p.m. on WFSU TV. And then Age of Nature, of course, will air on October 14th, premieres. It's a 3-part series, 3 Wednesdays in a row, October 14th at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. And I know some people on this are not local, so you can watch that on your local PBS station. And I want to thank Brian for joining us today, and also for taking me out to the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines, and super fun shoot out there, and climbing to ravines and learning about longleaf pine. And I think that's it. And this recording will be made available on the WFSU.org/ecology blog. And anyone who signed up for this will get an email with that recording on there, and we'll make that public as well. So thanks everybody for joining us today in the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines super condensed 30-minute field trip.